It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey Not the Face with your host John Nash and your producer me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are looking at Eddie Hearn's list of demands to keep the boxing match between Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury on track for Madison Square Garden. But is there a full list of demands is the real question here. Now, we also look at his beef with Zuffa's involvement and supposed demands of Sela and Riyadh season. And we discuss Dana White's reveal of what Contender Series fighters have made in UFC pay since its inception almost 10 years ago. And we also discuss how matching clauses work in UFC contracts. There's more, but I'm not going to list every single thing. What I am going to do is I'm going to tell you to pick up a paid subscription so that you have access to everything we're going to talk about today, because all our shows are divided into two pieces, split down the middle. You get the first half for free, but the second half is behind a paywall, so only paid subscribers get access to that. And paid subscribers also get access to all the documents that we include in our posts. Almost every single post has a PDF of some sort that John pays for through Pacer. So he gives away this stuff, but only to the paid subscribers. So you're gonna wanna rustle through your couch cushions and pony up all that change and send it our way. And you help us keep the lights on too. And if you can't afford to, pick up a paid subscription, help us out. Share our content around, because that is also a big boon to us. So please help us out, share it around, and subscribe. Now, John, it's kind of been a busy day today with all this boxing goss that's going around. How have you been?
Good. I missed most of it because I was working, which I can't believe they asked that I actually work instead of doing other stuff, but I was working. So I missed most of it, but we caught up on a lot of it. It seems to be developing, so we might miss some stuff. I know that Eddie Hearn released an interview like right before, I guess a couple hours before, but we just caught it, parts of it right before we recorded. So there is, back and forth discussions going on, but I think we've got the kind of the gist of everything that's going on right now. So we should be able to cover it decently. Although, of course, I believe you made the strategic decision that's going to be behind the paywall. So now the moochers get that part.
That's right. This is cutting edge news. So we want to make sure that our paid subscribers get to listen to you talk about it first. I'm sure we'll be discussing this over the course of the next couple of weeks, all the way up until the fight actually happens. So, our non-paying subscribers will definitely get to hear some content. But for today, it will be behind the paywall. But we have some great stuff that's not going to be paywalled. And I'm going to start off with the question I always start off with. Are there any new filings or updates in the UFC antitrust cases?
Updates, no, but filings, yes. There were 3 documents that were just filed today in the Johnson v. Zuffa case. That's August 20th, 2026. We always record the night before, so if you're wondering the exact date, it was August 20th, 2026. They were posted to Pacer. That's for the Johnson v. Zuffa case and related Davis v. Zuffa antitrust litigation. Interesting enough, Misha v. Zuffa was not included in this, just those two. And all this was before the magistrate judge, Brenda Wexler, who's the magistrate, kind of goes over the squabbles between the two parties, the stuff that they don't want to present in front of Judge Boulware. So the first one was a joint proposed scheduling order, and that is the plaintiffs, in this case, the plaintiffs are the fighters, CB Dalloway, Tristan Connolly, and Cajun Johnson. Those are the named plaintiffs. That's why it's Cajun Johnson, Johnson v. Zuffa, and Phil Davis is the other one for the other case. That's the plaintiffs, and the defendants, who are the UFC, aka Zuffa, also Endeavor, and TKA Group Holdings now. They both submitted dueling schedules because they couldn't agree. So again, surprise, surprise, they can't agree. So the two live disputes between the two of them is the timing of sanction motions. The plaintiffs, they want to file spoliation sanction motions before expert discovery, with expert reports following 30 days after a sanctions ruling, arguing the scope of a sanctions order could reshape what experts even need to analyze. Defendants want the sanctions briefing pushed to after both fact and expert discovery close. And this is per the court's own comments at the previous, August 6th hearing earlier this month, arguing they need discovery into plaintiffs' own use of ephemeral messaging apps first, and that sanctions issues are inextricably intertwined with expert forensic analysis. And so we talked about this last episode, if you recall, that the defendants made a big deal about the plaintiffs' fighters using ephemeral messaging apps. Of course, the big difference was when at least according to their, the reply, when the fighters were asked to retain, preserve, and hand over that material from those apps, they did so immediately. In fact, it looks in some cases they might have started the process even before the defendants finished their requests. Where, on the other hand, when you look at what Shapiro and Emmanuel and others did with TKO, they obscured the fact, they hid the fact that they had ephemeral messaging, and also deleted it apparently, or removed it from their phones, lost the messages, whatever. So there seems to be a little bit of difference, but we did bring up how they seem to be making a big case that perhaps to argue that there's no difference between the two sides on that matter. Now, the other dispute they have is whether Davis proceeds on Johnson's timeline. That's the Phil Davis case. The plaintiffs want the newer Davis case, which is a case where Davis doesn't represent UFC fighters, he represents all fighters outside the UFC, to run in parallel with Johnson, citing Davis's urgency, giving his age, career stage, and that his proposed injunctive class won't need an opt-out period. Defendants want Davis's class cert and summary judgment briefing stage to begin only after Johnson is resolved, citing distinct legal issues. And this they bring up as arbitration, the lease settlement, cross-promotion, compensation comparisons, and also a Seventh Amendment jury trial argument against leapfrogging the earlier filed case. Now, this is kind of key between the two because if we recall, we've discussed the Davis case at length previously, if you want to go back to old episodes, but I'll summarize here. The thing about the Davis case is they are not looking for damages. They are looking for just injunctive relief. He is representing all fighters outside the UFC. They cannot ask for damages, but they want injunctive relief. And they specify in the complaint kind of what they're looking for, a maximum 1-year promotional agreement contract for UFC fighters to create competition in the market. Now, that's important to the Johnson case because imagine if both cases proceed at the same pace, but the thing is, Davis is not asking for damages. So if Davis gets class certed, Davis is not a jury trial. Davis goes to the judge. It's a bench trial. The judge Boulware would decide it. So it, in many ways, at that point, leapfrog the Johnson case. And if it did that, then what could happen is the judge, if he ruled in favor of Davis, the judge then could grant injunctive relief, is what he's asking for. And the UFC would be looking at 1-year contracts with the Johnson case following it, in which they would no longer need to ask for injunctive relief. They could just go for pure damages as much as possible. There'd be some concern from the defendants there because there's little to negotiate away for the damages. At the same time, for the plaintiffs, the benefit of doing Davis is if the UFC sees that this is moving ahead and this is going to go to a bench trial, you would have to imagine that even when there's an inkling that it could go to bench trial, they would want to settle it because the risk to the UFC of having Judge Boulware issue a 1-year maximum contract as part of injunctive relief would be just devastating to their business model, right? And for that reason, they would immediately probably call the plaintiff and say, listen, we want to settle both cases, all our cases, for whatever amount of money, like, $1 billion plus some sort of in between where we are now and where Davis is contracts. And that would be a massive win for the fighters. And they would have that leverage specifically because Davis is there threatening them before even the Johnson case goes into trial. So for the plaintiffs, it makes sense. They want to have both proceeding at the same time. And for the defendants, it makes a lot of sense that they want this done after the Johnson case is done, because then it cannot be used as a massive cudgel to basically intimidate them into settling. So that's the issue there, I believe. I think it's pretty obvious that's the concern for both parties on that one. The second document that was delivered that we got is a motion to seal Exhibit 2, the Axelrod declarations. And this is just a routine sealing motion. The defendant asked to seal in full a Charles River Associates expert report that was dated from June 29, 2026, containing custodian material, phone numbers, device serial numbers, passwords, message metadata, all that stuff. And the court already indicated previously in previous hearings that it intended to seal this material while still entering it into the record. So just for being a completist, I included that. So we will have that just for the completists out there that need to see everything. We will still put that up on the Substack for you to look through. I don't imagine who would want to, but there's some of you guys that can't stop watching every fight that ever existed. For those same people, there's every document that we'll post. And the third one was Zuffa TKO's counterproposal on mobile device extraction protocols. And this is a pretty substantive document here because the background, the court's own Rule 706 expert, the famous or infamous at this point, Eric Whedon, who was originally recommended by the plaintiffs and assigned by the judge, was terminated after admitting he personally wiped Dana White's iPhone 11 Pro, the device at the center of the spoliation dispute, during the court-ordered examination process. The defendants say this cost them over $500,000 in forensic response costs and destroyed evidence they needed to rebut plaintiff's spoliation claims. So in the wake of that failure, the court asked defendants to counterpropose an access protocol after plaintiff demanded near total forensic access to 23 mobile devices belonging to 6 custodians, and those included Dana White, Hunter Campbell, Sean Shelby, Mick Maynard, Tracy Long, etc. The defendants' opposition to this, backed by declaration from the forensic VP Adam Hart, argued that the plaintiffs' proposed redact and reinsert methodology, which is editing the native database files and writing them back into the forensic images. This is stuff I know very little about, so hopefully I'm getting it right. Is not an accepted forensics practice and has never been peer-reviewed or validated. And per Hart's own testing on a sample, iOS 17 extraction doesn't even work, according to him. Messages, content plaintiffs wanted redacted remain recoverable in the body field via data carving and then biome app intent artifacts, even after the prescribed steps were followed. Now, hopefully Chris from Jersey is listening and he can contact me and Stephanie to explain all this, what this really means. So we can come back and tell you guys if they're being accurate or not, but that's what they're discussing here. According to the defendants, the proposal would take an estimated 12 to 24 months and cost over $4 million in forensic fees. It would require line-by-line attorney review of 7.3 million text messages across terabytes of data to screen for privileged spousal communications, medical info, and unrelated business communications, with no reliable way to separate message content from metadata in many of the targeted databases. Applying it to Android devices is essentially undefined, since plaintiff's protocol is written entirely in an Apple iOS terminology, and Dana White's iPhone 11 Pro being wiped by the court's own expert now permanently undermines any comparative what's missing analysis for that custodian or successor device. That's according again to the defendants here. The defendants counterpropose an incremental request by request, device by device process instead. Plaintiffs specify what artifacts fields they need. Defendants expert locate that material in the original unaltered extraction. Counsel reviews for privilege, and only the screened exported data is produced, leaving the original forensic images untouched. And so also filed with this is a Joseph Axelrod supporting declaration and something from Eric Whedon, which is now part of the record, giving his central role in the spoliation dispute. Good old Eric Whedon.
The man that never goes away.
No, he's now a part of the record. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if he gets called in, but you can obviously see that what the debate is about, because the plaintiffs want to get as much material as possible. The defendants want to piecemeal it out, so probably drag it out as long as possible and hand over as little as possible. And on top of that is the defendants already laying the defense that whatever case the plaintiffs make has been destroyed because the key evidence they were looking for was probably on Dana White's phone that was wiped.
Yeah, right. All right. So we will keep everyone updated on all court proceedings and filings every episode. Right now, though, I want to talk to you about a brief conversation you had on Twitter about UFC contract matching clauses. Can you update us on how those work?
This had to really do with PFL because of the contract of Usman Nurmagomedov, him fighting his last fight, potentially a free agent. And there was some discussion about, they originally right now he has a exclusive negotiating period, but after that, what's the matching rights that they have? And so there was discussion about that on X. Comparison to other promotions, and people ask me what are the matching rights right now for the various promotions, namely the UFC. The UFC, interesting enough, has the shortest matching rights currently, which I'm sure is kind of shocking to a lot of people because everybody is probably used to the UFC being the most draconian contracts. And we always bring up, how unfair their contracts are. But surprising, their contracts have the lowest matching rights. Now, that's not always true. Up until recently, they had much longer matching rights. And for those curious what matching rights are, the matching period. When your contract is done, the terms of your contract are finished, you are not automatically a free agent. You can't instantly start negotiating with all the other promoters to sign a new contract. Almost all contracts in MMA and boxing as well often have an exclusive negotiating period. And that's usually shorter, anywhere from a few weeks to a few months. And during that exclusive negotiating period at the end of your contract, you can only negotiate with your previous promoter. So in this case, if you're signed to the UFC and your contract ends for the next X amount of time, you can only negotiate with the UFC during that time as they try to come up with a deal that you'll accept. After that, you're free to negotiate with other people. But if you agree to a new promotional agreement with another promoter, you have certain number of days. It can be 10 to 15 days, depending on the promotion, depending on the period of time that the contract was from. You have to submit that contract to your previous promoter again, in this case, the UFC, for example, and they have an opportunity to then match the material terms of the contract. So, the amount of money, the amount of fights, that's what they have to match. And if they agree, guess what? You're still a fighter for the UFC. You cannot sign with that other promoter. And an example of that, the use of a matching period and actually using the matching rights happened with the PFL. Remember when Kayla Harrison originally finished her previous 2 contracts ago contract with the PFL? She was a free agent. She negotiated and signed apparently a very lucrative deal with Bellator, but never fought in Bellator. Why? Because the PFL exercised their matching rights and basically brought her back to PFL under this new contract, which did not have a matching period at the end of it this time because they had already used the matching rights to retriever. So that's an example of a contract using the matching period. We saw another example years ago, somewhat famously, when the Fertitos, Lorenzo Fertitta, used it when Gilbert Melendez signed with Bellator. Seems like a lot of guys going to Bellator got stopped by matching rights. But, traditionally, for the longest time, the matching period for almost every promotion was 12 months. Bellator, back in the Bjorn Rebney day, had a terrible matching rate, so it was 18 months. They could go up to 18 months to match a contract, but almost everybody had a 12-month period. And still, there are still some 12-month periods floating around. But the last few years, what happened is the UFC limited their matching rights to only 4 months, at least in the contracts I saw. And it seemed to correspond. It seemed to line up almost exactly with the negotiations for the settlement for the Levy Zuffa case. And so the first incident of someone having a 4-month matching right in the UFC itself, not counting Contender Series, because those are separate contracts, they're not quite as stringent, but fighters in the UFC having a 4-month matching period was only a few months before they first announced there were going to be a settlement in the Levy Zuffa case. And then lo and behold, when the settlement was first, remember the original settlement in Levy Zuffa was announced and they released the details. One of the things was that the UFC would have only a 4-month matching period instead of the original 12-month, and only a 1-month exclusive negotiating period instead of the original 3 months. I don't think that's much of a win for the fighters at that time, but that was announced as part of the settlement. And in the end, the Judge Bulwer threw it out anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But it seems to me kind of obvious now in hindsight, when you look at it, the period that was introduced, what happened is that while they were negotiating with the plaintiffs, or while they're getting ready to negotiate, they decided that this is something that they are going to agree to, and they introduced it ahead of time. And then they stuck with it for a while. Now, to be fair, I have not seen UFC contracts in a while. I should say not in a while. I've seen several, but no contract that's been signed in, let's say, the last 12 months, I believe, maybe a little sooner than that. But at least in this 2026, I've seen no UFC contract that's been signed in 2026 yet. But all the ones I saw before have 4-month matching periods. And after the UFC did that, I also noticed that when that was introduced, it seemed to have some impact on the competitors because, one, some of their contracts are at 6 months, although I did note some of them are still at 12 months matching periods. But almost all PFL contracts that I've seen have 6-month matching periods now compared to the previous 12-month. And so there seems to be a change in the industry now because we're getting further and further away from that settlement, and there was no injunctive relief component to that settlement. I'm not certain that's going to remain, as we saw with the sunset clause in the UFC contracts. That has been tremendously watered down from what it was in the past. I would not doubt that maybe in the future going forward, we will see the matching period revert back to a longer period. But for right now, it's relatively short. And surprising enough, the shortest matching period that I've seen of late belongs to the UFC. They have the least restrictive when it comes to the exclusive negotiating period, only 1 month, and the matching period of just 4 months.
Well, all right. Now, Dana White has been talking a lot to reporters lately. And one of the things that got mentioned this past week was a claim that he made that fighters who earned UFC contracts through the Contender Series have made a combined total of $225.3 million. Now, I want to get your take on that figure, especially considering that there's fighters out there that came from the Contender Series like Sean O'Malley who have made a bundle more than other fighters. He's probably the highest paid Contender Series guy ever. And that Contender Series has been around for almost 10 years. Like in like 7 months, it'll be 10 years that Contender Series has been around. That's a long time to only make $225.3 million, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, are you ready to have some fun with numbers?
Oh, yes. Yeah, always.
Yeah. I know people just love numbers. But Dana White threw that out. It does. I'm sure a lot of people are like 225 million. That's impressive. But where's the context of that, right? How many fighters have come through? Which fighters? Now we know some of them have turned out to be champions. Sean O'Malley, you said, Merab, probably making millions per title fight when they're at the top. We know for a fact from Sean O'Malley talking about it when he did not have the title, his pay dropped tremendously to like 600,000, I think he said, in that ballpark. But these fighters, you add up the total number of fights. Kevin Holland has fought like 20 fights in the UFC now and has a pretty, for UFC standards, a very decent veteran contract. I can't remember the total amount, but something like, I'm going to throw out a number. I could be off here, like 200,000 a show and 200,000 to win. So some of those fighters are making, compared to other fighters, decent amount of money in the grand scheme of things, but other fighters are not. And, and this is the total is the average. So if you compare it, there's a couple ways we can compare it to see, is this really that impressive, right? So we have 225 million. The first thing we should look at is probably, is we always talk about what is the wage share. And so during this period, the thing is, we know how much the UFC generated in revenue during the period they're talking about. During the time, at least, within, a month, I guess we could say that the Dana White's Contender Series has been on the air since August. I think it started in 2017. So since then, up until June 30th of this year, when we had the last quarterly returns submitted to the SEC, we know that the total amount that the UFC has made is $10.1 billion during that time. So $10.1 billion. And then if you compare that $10.1 billion to the $225 million that they got, that is, that's less than 2.5%. We are talking much less. It's actually 2.2% of the total revenue during that time. So fighters on the Contender Series during this time that they've been fighting in the UFC from the Contender Series, they have made 2.2% of all the revenue generated. Okay, well, that doesn't tell us everything because we also have to know what are the total number of fighters? How does that compare to all the other fighters? Well, we do also have an inkling of what all the fighters in the UFC have made from during this period as well, because as part of the settlement period, when they're negotiating the settlement, they released a summary of what UFC fighters in the Johnson class period have earned. And that class, the Johnson class, during that time, up until I think it was April 2023, had earned about $1 billion in pay. During that period, from 2017 to 2023, they had earned $1 billion in total, a little over 6 years in total earnings, payout compensation during that period. Well, as we've repeatedly calculated, if we use the percentage that they made, about 16.9%, or if we use our estimates that we've come, up with, either way, we come to a pretty close figure. About 1.6 billion UFC fighters have made around there. It could be off by a little bit. It could be 1.550, could be 1.65, but I believe we're in the ballpark of 1.6 billion is the total amount UFC fighters have made from the start of the Dana White's Contender Series until now, basically, I guess up until last quarter. So we're not including Conor McGregor's most recent fights. But so that's 1.6 billion. Now, of that 1.6 billion, that's of $10 billion total. That means fighters, the total number of fighters has made 16% of all the revenue in the UFC during that period, whereas Contender Series fighters have made 2.2% of all the revenue. And if we take that 225 million and divide it into the 1.6 billion, we see that the fighters have made about 14% of the total, 14% of all the fighter revenue paid out. I should say 14% of all the money paid to the fighters has been paid to Dana White Contender Series fighters. So, is that a lot or not? Well, how many of the UFC roster has been Contender Series fighters? Well, there's a little discrepancy there because no one seems to know how many there really is. I looked it up, and there seems to be two numbers thrown around. 390 fighters and 375 fighters have fought in the UFC from the Contender Series. And so if you look at that percentage, and then you look at how many fights have they done? Well, it looks like the Contender Series fighters have done about 2,000 fights out of the total 9,000 approximate fights that the UFC has had. Well, those 2,000 fights is 22% of all UFC fights, right? So they make up 22% of all UFC fights, but they also make up 14% of all the revenue paid. So it does seem like, again, that seems like Contender Series fighters make up almost a quarter of all the fights now during this period that the UFC has had, but they're 1/7, now 1/4 of the pay that fighters make. So on average, it seems, that just reveals that they make less on average than other fighters, which I don't think surprises anybody.
Sounds like they're being exploited.
The one problem with this is you could not, it's almost impossible to determine, are they replacing fighters that would have made more, or is this just the natural churn, and they just represent a way for fighters to come in differently? That's kind of hard, but it does seem like they are used as an avenue to bring in more affordable fighters because they're on cheaper contracts. So I mean, exploited? Yeah, I mean, yes, but all fighters are generally exploited. The other way to look at it
seems like they're exploited more, though.
In some ways, what it reminds me about is what we've always talked about the Ultimate Fighter TV series. Is that those fighters, in this case, it's a little different. What made the Ultimate Fighter terrible is those fighters, yes, they got some promotion. They got put on a big, on the TV and made build a fan base easier because of that. But they also were signed to these terrible 9-10 fight contracts, right? That they were locked into. And so you were now a main event type star, main card or main eventing or even fighting for a title, and you're still stuck on your terrible Contender
Roy Nelson.
Ultimate Fighter. Yes.
Roy Nelson was the worst of it.
He might have been because, he was a known commodity before. I mean, the UFC is obviously going to claim we churned him into a star, a bigger star than he ever had been because we put him on the Ultimate Fighter. But you also got 9 fucking cheap fights out of him for that. I can't remember. They negotiated slightly before the end of it. But, we've heard from almost every fighter. Nate Diaz talked about that he was still stuck on his Ultimate Fighter contract. So they're not the best deals. In some ways, this reminds me of that. Now, the only good news for contenders is when they come to the UFC, they do not sign the same 9-fight deals. They come in on a 4 or 5-fight deal. So it's not quite as long. So that's a benefit. But they still, it's a way to bring fighters in. We've seen fighters that have some renown, some presence coming in on these bare minimum contenders contracts because that's why you enter the UFC now. And so people are willing to basically take a pay cut.
To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Okay, the face!